Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I enjoy debates because sometimes I have a few notes prepared, but it's often better if Canadians are watching this debate for me to rebut some of the ridiculous positions just outlined by the Deputy House Leader for the Liberal Party and so ably, ridiculously outlined by the Parliamentary Secretary, Madam Speaker, because if Canadians are concerned why C-47 is before this House and perhaps why Canada didn't sign on to the UN's Arms Trade Treaty, I'll explain why that didn't happen under the Conservative government. And I will explain why there are concerns about C-47 and its companion bill, C-71, which has sport shooters, lawful gun owners, hunters concerned, Madam Speaker, about a return to the Allen Rock-style gun registry of the past. These are valid concerns, and I'm going to show why reasonable questions have been asked by Canadians of this government, and they've been ignored. Not only ignored, but they're trying to wedge urban versus rural Canada, the same old things we saw from Allen Rock and Jean Chrétien decades ago, Madam Speaker. In their remarks, they said the Conservatives are saying things that aren't true. My friend said it's crystal clear that firearms aren't going to be, lawful use of firearms aren't going to be caught by C-47 and C-71. I'm going to explain why the Conservative government didn't sign on to the UNATT, and I would note several other countries have not either, Madam Speaker. But as we heard at committee from Steve Torino, who was involved at the time with the Canadian delegation and the advisors to the government on the UN Arms Trade Treaty, Canada was consistently asking for a carve-out for the lawful use and cultural use of firearms by hunters, by Aboriginal Canadians, by sport shooters. Canada was consistently advocating for a specific carve-out in the body of the treaty, Madam Speaker. Canada, under the Conservative government, didn't just roll over. We expressed our desire to see an outcome that was fair to our citizens. We could not get that, so we kept pushing, Madam Speaker. This government rolled over, and there was not such a provision provided in the UN treaty. In fact, the only reference to the lawful use went in the preamble to the treaty, Madam Speaker, which said, I quote, "Mindful of legitimate trade and lawful ownership and use of certain conventional arms for recreational, cultural, historical, and sporting activities where such trade, ownership, and use are permitted and protected by law," Madam Speaker. Unfortunately, a preamble reference is not a specific treaty provision or section, Madam Speaker. It is insufficient. And in fact, I quoted U of T law professor Kent Roach at committee, I'll quote him to this House, to say it's a mug's game to rely on a preamble, as the Parliamentary Secretary seems to think is sufficient. What did Professor Roach say about preambles, Madam Speaker? Quote, "Preambles can oversell legislation, either by expressing unrealistic hopes that are not always supported by the fine print or the text of the law, or by suggesting that we can have it all," end quote, Madam Speaker. So only fools rely on preambles, Madam Speaker, and we've heard a good dose of their perspective here this morning. As a lawyer, I want to see something in the print of the treaty, Madam Speaker. And that's what Canada was pushing for. And we should not sign treaties until we're satisfied that Aboriginal use of firearms, hunters, traditional cultural uses, fair, some of the most lawful Canadians are respected. Now, these same Canadians have asked the Parliamentary Secretary and the Liberals to provide that same specific exemption in C-47. In fact, Greg Farrant from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, Steve Torino, as I mentioned, been working on these. In fact, our committee acknowledged that it would be reasonable to put this provision directly in C-47, because we cannot rely on the preamble at law, Madam Speaker. So, did that happen? No. In fact, the Conservatives were prepared to work with the government on C-47 if we could get that bare bones, reasonable assurance. So when they stand in this House and suggest that we're misleading Canadians or that we're not telling the truth, I will go to any of their ridings and have this same conversation. because I'm not using talking points from the Prime Minister's office. I know this bill, and I know the history of it, Madam Speaker. And what Canada was asking for is reasonable. It's reasonable to say that First Nations can continue to use rifles and to do their traditional hunt, which is protected by Supreme Court decision, Madam Speaker. Lawful ownership in Canada, some of our most law-abiding citizens use their right responsibly, Madam Speaker. So once again, 47 with its companion C-71 sets up this dynamic that the Liberals are trying to portray some Canadians as being unreasonable or being risks. And that is divisive, Madam Speaker. What is also divisive is these suggestions that without this bill, gender-based violence or human rights crimes would not be, we'd be able to sell arms to those countries. In fact, Wendy Gilmore, the Director General of this part of the Department of Government that manages the country control list, manages these controlled goods, said clearly at committee, those abilities to remove due to sanction, human rights abuse, violence, to preclude arms sales has existed since 1986. In fact, she referred to the memo from Joe Clark, Madam Speaker. Last I checked, that was a Conservative member of Parliament, Mr. Speaker, the ability to stop arms sales in these circumstances. So it's misleading Canadians to suggest that without Bill C-47, we're going to be suddenly selling arms in situations where there's ethnic cleansing or gender-based violence. That's misleading and unfair once again, Madam Speaker. And I'd invite the Parliamentary Secretary to look at the committee transcripts where his senior official acknowledges this. Since 1986. In fact, in my last speech on this issue, Madam Speaker, I said how since the 1940s, Canada has had a superior arms control regulatory regime to the ATT, Madam Speaker. Superior on many fronts. And in fact, the area control list, which right now has North Korea on it as the only country, we've had, through legislation and regulation for decades, the ability to stop all trade of all goods with the country, Madam Speaker. And Wendy Gilmore acknowledged this, the DG, in committee, when she said, indeed, the purpose of the area control list is to give the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Government of Canada the ability to control, but not necessarily restrict, the movement of any items to a country listed on the area control list, Madam Speaker. So for decades, we've been able to responsibly control the movement of military goods, nuclear materials, Madam Speaker. Canada's actually been a leader in this. Since 1986, since the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney, we've also been able to restrict due to concerns with respect to human rights abuses, a range of other things. Canada is a responsible player, Madam Speaker. So when the government puts C-47 and its companion C-71 up to once again sow division, they're doing so based on a premise that is not only false, but it's misleading. And if they think that a preamble provides the appropriate protections for the lawful use by Canadians, by Indigenous Canadians, they're showing that they don't understand that you go and you fight for Canadian interests when you're negotiating an international treaty, Madam Speaker. But when you look at C-71 being brought in shortly after C-47, you see the real concerns that some Canadians have is that they're bringing back the gun registry of the Chrétien-Rock era, and now they're going to be providing the provision of records or this same approach to the United Nations, Madam Speaker. That is terrible, because Canada should be very proud of the fact that we have one of the most responsible regimes for the trade of military-type goods, controlled goods, and we have since the 1940s. In fact, this week in Ottawa, we're going to see the defence and security industry at the CANSEC show. Tens of thousands of Canadians that work in the defence and security industries, Madam Speaker. We've been a world leader on satellite technology, on aerospace. We were the third or fourth to have controlled nuclear fission, Madam Speaker. We are leaders in these technologies. We're also leaders when it comes to regulation. What I'd like to see the Liberal government stop is this divisive, inaccurate and biased approach to legislation, Madam Speaker. I'm happy to come to their riding to debate these things, not just in the House of Commons, because These are the facts, Madam Speaker, and this is why we have concerns about both of these bills.